So two of the themes I wanted to get into at the beginning of our discussion are, first of all, this idea of mixture and some of the divisions that we see in American society. And then secondly, after that, we'll move on to some thoughts about progress, what it means, what's good about it, bad about it, and your particular perspectives. So let me start by asking you, Senator Vance. You're someone who, in political life, has had to deal with a mixture of the few and the many. The few who are deeply politically engaged, the few who might be considered the political establishment, or for that matter, the Senate itself is obviously a body of quite a few people, and also the many. You are someone who represents the great many of Ohio. You're someone who, in fact, I think for Americans across the country, is a voice of the many. How do you balance in practice and in sort of the combination of theory and practice, the few and the many as an office holder, as a statesman?
Well, first, Dan, thanks for doing this, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to Patrick, of course, for writing a great book. I guess I think that things in American society are so tilted towards the few that I just worry about the many and let the rest of it figure itself out, right? So I sort of see my role and my voice as being explicitly anti-elitist, explicitly anti-regime, and to the extent that we can sort of elevate voices that have been largely ignored, that's the role that I play, and I think that hopefully I can play a part in that balance. But I don't see myself as trying to concoct the balance myself. I see myself as a corrective. One observation I just wanted to make on this question of mixture, and I was thinking about this as Patrick was speaking. We on the right, on the sort of the post-liberal right or the new right, or however we want to define what it is, this sort of hodgepodge of people and ideologies that have sort of collected themselves here today. I think that we are really, really kidding ourselves about the weight of the challenge. And when we talk about changing the regime, which is in fact a word that I myself have used before, I agree with Patrick, and I think we have to be clear-eyed about how difficult it is. And let me just illustrate this with one particular issue. One of the hangovers, one of the really bad hangovers from that sort of uniparty that Patrick and Dean talked about is this idea that there is this extremely strong division between the public sector and the private sector. You know, the public sector, there's the necessary evil of government. We want to limit it as much as possible because to the extent that we don't limit it, it's going to do a lot of terrible things. And then you have the private sector, sort of that which comes from spontaneous order. It's organic. It's very Burkean, and we want to let people sort of do as much free exchange within that realm as possible. And in the reality of politics, as I've seen it practiced, the way that lobbyists interact with bureaucrats, interact with corporations, there is no meaningful distinction between the public and the private sector in the American regime. It is all fused together. It is all melded together. And it is all, in my view, very much aligned against the people who I represent in the state of Ohio. I will give you a couple of examples here. One, when I talk to sort of more traditionalist economic conservatives, what Patrick would call economic liberals, when I talk to these guys about, for example, why has corporate America gone so woke, I see in their eyes this desperate desire to think that it's all just coming from the SEC, that there are a couple of bad regulations at the SEC, and that, in fact, Larry Fink would love to not be a super woke a driver of American enterprise, and that Budweiser has no desire to put out a series of advertisements that alienate half of their customer base. They're just being forced to do it by evil bureaucrats. And there is an element of truth to that. But the element of truth to that is that the regime is the public and private sector. It's the corporate CEOs. It's the HR professionals at Budweiser, and they are working together, not against one another, in a way that destroys the American common good. That is the fact that we are dealing with, and that's something that I think we have to be mindful of. The one final point that I'll make, somewhat related to your point, Dan, but as I was talking, I thought about this, and I have the microphone, and nobody's going to tell me to shut the hell up, so I'll just go ahead and make this point. One just sort of practical piece of guidance I'd give for to your point about practicality versus high-mindedness, and I'm the lowly, very practical U.S. senator here on the stage, is I would say that we should be extremely mindful to something Patrick said about the real population that we're dealing with, not a sort of phantom or an abstraction or this idea that they're somehow perfect and that they're perfectly aligned with our politics. People are complicated. And let me just give you one example from the campaign trail. I think Patrick has heard me tell this story. I don't know that anybody else in this room has. I was at a campaign event sort of 3 or 4 months before the election. It was after the primary. It was before the general election. And I was talking to probably a 45-year-old black woman who came up to me and told me she was pro-life, she was a Democrat, and I was the first Republican she was going to vote for. And I remember at the time thinking, this is the very sort of person that my very intellectual new right friends think that we need to be appealing to, and they're right about that, by the way, but also think that is a natural constituency for the Republican Party. And I don't think they're necessarily right about that, at least the Republican Party as it's currently constituted, because what she told me was not about the fact that I was maybe more pro-labor than the average Republican, or I was more pro-working class than the average Republican. What she said, and I quote, speaking about my book, is, "You've been hit in the face and no other politician has." That was why she was voting for me. Not because of any high-minded reason, but because she thought too many politicians were cowards and I had been hit in the face and survived it. That's who we're dealing with. And to Patrick's point, I think there's wisdom in that approach, not just a sort of lack of sophistication. I think a lot of people want to see in that woman a lack of sophistication. I think it's important we see the wisdom, but we see it with very clear eyes.